So welcome to the AWS Public Sector Summit. As Seabreeze mentioned, my name is Doerr, Solutions Architect with the AWS Public Sector team. Joining me today is Brett Miller, Solutions Architect on our Professional Services Organization. And then also joining us is Ray Obrien, Service Manager for NASA's Enterprise Managed Cloud Computing Environment. So the backdrop of today's discussion actually goes back to 2002, at least the origin. The public sector, the reInvent session had a fireside chat with Jeff Bezos, Werner Vogels. And during the course of that discussion, Jeff said he gets a question a lot. What's going to change in the next 10 years? And he said, you know what, that's an interesting question. But an even more interesting question is what's not going to change? I would submit to you that one of those things that's not going to change in the next 10 years is IT governance, especially in the cloud. Okay? What has changed in recent years, however, is our approach to that governance process. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So while the need for IT governance hasn't gone away, the objective of it also hasn't changed. Aligning your IT resources with your mission, whatever your organization is supposed to be doing or your program of record is supposed to be doing. Okay? The idea that you need to understand the components of your environment, your web services, your databases, your networks, how all those things relate to the solution that you have in place for part of your business. Understand whether it's in compliance. Is it deployed in a repeatable, consistent way? Are costs controlled? Do you understand what your budgeting is? Is it secure? And where are things? Who's touching them? So answering all these questions is an objective of governance at scale. So I'd like you to come away from today's session with a couple of takeaways. First off, why multi-account? Why do multiple AWS accounts matter to you? What are the implications in terms of your ability to manage cost and, more importantly, your security posture? Account management, which accounts are you going to create? How are they organized? How do you align them to your organization? Okay. Build and automation is incredibly important, and we'll go through some discussion around how that automation plays out, how it gets triggered, what it looks like. Again, the idea is for you to be able to have a consistent, repeatable environment. Once you have that consistent, repeatable environment, you now have a baseline. You can audit against that. You can manage it over time. You don't understand drift. Then there's cost and compliance controls. How are you going to manage understanding that your solution is under cost control, within budget? What are the financial operations around it? How are you going to allocate costs back to your tenants? Compliance controls. How do you know on a regular basis that your cloud environment, your entire estate, is actually in compliance with whatever you're supposed to be compliant to? FedRAMP, HIPAA, PCI, you name it. Okay. So a little bit of audience participation. Who has workloads that need to be compliant to one of the big compliance programs like FedRAMP, HIPAA, PCI? Okay, so a fair number. Who's launching workloads into AWS or either migrating or building new in the near future? So again, all the rest of you, you should be doing that, please. If you raise your hand at a time, you definitely need an approach to managing your cloud environment, because chances are you're not going to be putting one workload into the cloud. You are going to be putting multiple workloads in the cloud. What we find is that once customers take one initial step using one use case, there's a second, and a third, and a 10th, and a 20th. Having that structure in place helps you manage your organization better, helps you be more compliant, helps you be more consistent. Okay. So cloud governance, in a lot of respects, is a lot like building and managing a multi-tenant structure, like an apartment building. Okay. So first off, like any good business, you start with, well, what does your customer want? You work backwards from there. Well, what they want is, well, floor plans and location and how many bathrooms and what am I doing about storage and all these other things, right? Then you add in all the stuff that you need to do to actually make it happen. So how are you going to handle building security? And what about your permitting process and zoning? And all these various mundane things that have to get done in order for you to be able to open the door and actually have people move in. So very similarly, governance in the cloud has a lot of those, had a lot of parallels to that, a lot of the same big and small decisions. You're starting with your core mission. What are your customer requirements, your tenants? What do they need? The people that your organization is going to move into the cloud. What do they require in terms of compliance controls? Again, FISMA, HIPAA, and so forth. They may be different. They may all be the same and have the same requirement. Then you've got all kinds of other things like financial operations, your onboarding process. How are you going to handle mass migrations versus one-off applications, new builds? How are you handling infrastructure operations versus financial operations? What about single sign-on and networking? So all these decisions, you're saying, well, all this sounds very familiar, and it is. This is all very familiar to you. The approaches to it in the cloud, however, just operate at a little bit larger scale. So over time, the approaches to governance in the cloud have evolved. Okay? Andy Jassy once said that there's no compression algorithm for experience, and there isn't. Once customers moved from a few dozen applications and workloads in the cloud up to hundreds, and a few customers have gone, actually several customers have gone to thousands, you find that the old governance structures designed for an on-premise world don't scale up very effectively. And we started looking at, okay, well, what does scale up effectively? What approaches do scale up effectively? And that's what we've baked into today's discussion. So how do you translate all those things into action? And here's a framework that we've developed called Governance at Scale. And that consists of three major pieces. The first up, and kind of the bedrock of it, is account management. It's how do you build out your accounts? Which accounts are you going to build? How do you standardize them? How do you make them repeatable? Okay. Cost management, how are you going to control the costs? How are you monitoring your environment on a consistent basis? Not just looking at the bill, but also how do you reduce the bill? How do you hit a target next year of reducing your bill by 10%, 20%? Okay, what are the optimizations you can continue to make in your environment from an architectural perspective that will continue to drive down cost, improve efficiency? Looking at governance or compliance, how do you manage compliance? How do you monitor it on a very regular basis? How do you know that a baseline virtual private cloud that you just laid down an hour ago, how do you know right now it hasn't been changed? And if it has been changed, what are you going to do? So for today's discussion, we're going to focus on account management. That happens to be the bedrock of governance at scale. A little bit later today, my compatriot here, Brett, is delivering another session on governance at scale as well, managing multi-accounts in large environments this afternoon. So that's kind of a bit more of a counterpart to this discussion. So governance at scale builds on a number of cloud tenets. Okay? Just like everything in AWS, security is job one. Building security into your environment from the ground up. Okay? When you're building out your automation to build your accounts and build artifacts in your accounts and set up EC2 instances and EBS volumes and networks and databases, all those things need to be addressed from, with an eye towards, number one, security has to be built into that artifact from day one. You can't go back later on and adding it back in later on as an afterthought is not a good practice. Guardrails, not blockers. Again, you want to get to a point where you can build out and deploy an enterprise with tens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of workloads in the cloud. And I'm going to jump ahead a second and give you a little bit of definition here. I'm looking at a workload as a unique environment for an application. So if an application has 3 environments, that's 3 different workloads. They're related, but they're different. Applying guardrails to those applications so that your developers you can lay down guardrails. You can say you're not allowed to use services that aren't FedRAMPed or otherwise approved, or PCI compliant or SOC compliant or unless otherwise approved. And you can only do things in the US East and US West regions, or only in GovCloud region. Okay? Lay down those guardrails. That gives a lot of that gives everybody nice, neat swim lanes to work inside of, but it doesn't get anybody's way. You're going to need to make decisions around how much to centralize your governance process versus allowing decentralized implementation. Okay? And there's a fine line there. Every organization approaches this a little bit differently. Flexibility, one size doesn't fit all. The environment that you're going to be standing up, the automation you'll build out, the things to set up your environment may look differently depending on who your tenant is. You may have some tenant organizations that move into your environment that are very sophisticated. They understand DevOps, they understand coding, they understand the virtual environment very, very well. They understand how to work in AWS. Building applications happens to be a core competency for that organization because of what they do. Other parts of your organization may only be users of technology. They may not care or even have the IT staff to get into building their own applications. They simply want to use email and file sharing. They want to be able to post things up to a PR site so that content can get published. How that happens, they don't want to know. So you got very different perspectives and very different kinds of tenants coming in, very different floor plans that they want in that building. Automation. You cannot possibly hire enough people to do all the things in the cloud on a consistent basis without automation. Okay? To do all those things that have to be done. Whether it's building out accounts, laying down new networking, cleaning up old EBS volumes, dealing with incident response, monitoring on a continuous basis. How do you know that that security group that you set up 3 days ago is still exactly the same way as it was? And if it changed at some point, you can set up automation to change it back. Okay. Finally, infrastructure as code. In order to really scale up your governance environment, the days of going into the console and having admins create everything from scratch in the console are long gone. They may go there to create an initial asset, from that build a template, a CloudFormation template, a Terraform template, some kind of infrastructure as code artifact. Now that piece of code, that artifact, can be managed, versioned, controlled, all through its lifecycle. It can be executed again and again and again, and it'll work exactly the same way every single time. So the AWS account turns out to be very underappreciated, I think. Most people look at the Air account as a billing construct. It's simply where they go and sign up, and okay, you lay down your credit card, you set up a purchase order, and voila, we now have an account. Let's go build all our stuff. I'd like to take a little bit of a step back and look at 3 unique properties of the AWS account that we're going to leverage for governance at scale, and use the AWS account actually as a component of your enterprise architecture. First, it's your security and resource boundary. It is the thing into which your developers log in, your admins log into it. They log in through the console, through the command line interface. They might execute automation from a desktop inside your organization and have that push all kinds of activity across an API. Okay? But the account is the thing that they're always interacting with. It is the boundary. Number 2, it gives you your limits, your throttling. It's by default the thing that says you've got a default limit of 20 EC2 instances in an account. Most of our services have soft limits. You can have those increased. But you start out with a lower set of limits so that you don't accidentally blow out your account the next morning. You don't run a script that accidentally sets up 1,000 instances. Finally, there's billing separation. The idea that everything that happens in an account, you get a bill for. End of the month, you get your bill from AWS or from your reseller. Every 12 hours, there's a detailed billing report that drops that says, here's exactly what's been used. Here's all the services. Here's all the EC2 and the S3 storage and the RDS and the Dynamo. Here's all those artifacts, how much you've used, how much that's cost you in the last 12 hours. It also gives you a breakdown, and so you can go into those things and tag them all up. That's a best practice. Anything that can be tagged should be tagged. That's great. So now you can say, okay, well, show me all my EC2 within this account broken out by individual tags related to cost codes. Okay, so now you can say, okay, here's my EC2 instance related to my DMZ versus my application tier versus my database tier. So you've broken things up maybe by how your VPC or network is organized. Then there's all the overhead stuff. There's all the networking that can't be tagged. There's other things that cannot yet be tagged. That's kind of an overhead bucket. But at least you know within the four walls of that account how much it cost you in the last 12 hours, how much it cost you in the last 10 days, how much it cost you in the last month. Okay, you know exactly how much that workload costs, and that's another important characteristic. So we say that one account isn't enough anymore. The idea of putting all of your environment, your 10, 20, 30 applications, each one of them having 3 or 4 possible environments, you might be up to 60 different VPCs, 60 different unique environments at this point. Cramming them all into one account really doesn't scale very efficiently. It ends up with an environment that is very, very congested. The networking, it is what it is. You need probably a transit network to get between accounts or to get between VPCs. But your security posture, your security policies are more complicated, in fact, much more complicated. Your number of security roles within that account are much more complicated along with groups. Your ability to dissect that account, or the workloads in that one account by cost is extraordinarily difficult. Okay? More and more, we're telling our customers, we're advising, start with a multi-account strategy. Plan to start there from day one. Okay? One account is no longer enough. Building out multiple accounts will give you that scalability, that flexibility to move forward. And along the way, you gain a couple of benefits from it. Number one, you're taking those individual workloads, dev, test, production environments, and making them all their own account for a given program of record. You immediately gain 2 benefits. Number one, blast radius. From a security perspective, you've limited your blast radius. If your development account ever becomes compromised with a security incident, it's only your development account. However, if you've got that one account that has all 70 or 80 workloads inside of it, and part of it becomes compromised, how do you know for a fact that the entire rest of the environment isn't impacted? You can find out, but it's going to take you a lot more time. From a cost perspective, being able to break out those workloads, those environments into unique separate accounts now means that you know exactly how much development for that application cost, how much testing cost, how much production cost. How you manage the cost in the environments might be different. In your development and test environments, you might have policies that go in and say, nights and weekends, we're going to turn off all the EC2 instances that aren't tagged don't turn off. You can implement policies in an automated way that begin to help conserve your spend. So looking back at, there we go. In a lot of cases, we see organizations start with one account. A developer will set up the account, they'll set up a VPC, they'll move workload into it, and that VPC ends up being both dev, test, and, well, actually all 3. Dev, test, and production, right? Because, developing and production is always a good idea. Eventually, more workloads come into that account. Okay, network engineer says, hey, let's now network this also into, we'll put in a VPN gateway so we can now access it from on-premise, okay? They add in some security controls. Those security controls become a great deal more complicated because they have different workloads inside of it. They have different teams inside of it. They have development and testing and network engineering and security. They have all kinds of different organizations coming in at one account. So a better approach is to take those different environments and split them out, at a minimum, split them into different accounts. And the best case is to split them all into separate accounts. So how do you go about organizing your very many accounts? Because you're going to start with a cloud team that has a lot of different people on it. Again, you've got people that are security focused, people who are networking focused, storage focused. You have an on-premise, in a lot of cases, an on-premise organization that has evolved their practices, their organizational structure over decades. They all have their different view of the world. They all have different things that they want to accomplish. Okay? So we start splitting out into multiple accounts. For a given program of record, a system, you have your separate dev, test, and production accounts. If you have 10 applications, you have 30 of these. Okay? You might have sandbox accounts to drive innovation challenges, to drive proof of concept activities, to drive just basic learning. In environments where a developer can self-provision an account, sign up, get an account provision that has maybe a $50 spend limit on it for the month, and then at the end of the month, it gets terminated. It just goes away. Okay? They're disposable. Finally, you have your enterprise level accounts, things like a dedicated security account where you're going to run your SIEM tooling, your incident response tooling, your transit network that ties everything together, and it becomes the main access point for everything coming from on-premise. A shared services environment. Let's say you're running Active Directory in the cloud to authenticate users of your application, or possibly your admin users and developers. A logging account to consolidate all your enterprise logging in the cloud into one place, so that can now be ingested into tools like Splunk and Logarithm, for example. So you're setting up new policies, centralized policy management. You're doing cross-account access, and you're tying together all your logging across the enterprise. So when we look at it from an enterprise model, we start with a data center, and we go ahead and we stand up those landlord accounts, those enterprise level accounts. Okay? Development, test, your security, your billing, internal audit, logging, and they're all networked together in certain ways, right? Then you tie in your tenant accounts, okay? Your clusters of tenant accounts that tie to the individual programs of record. So development, test, production, there might be an individual sandbox for that program of record. It might have its own shared services if it's large enough. They all interact with your enterprise level accounts. And then finally, you've got your sandbox accounts that are nice and isolated. Again, they're throwaway accounts, very low budget limits, tight controls. They're not allowed to talk to each other. They're not allowed to talk to your on-premise world. They're not allowed to talk to the rest of your production environment. Okay? They're in a sandbox. Go do whatever experimentation you want to do. Try it out. If it's successful, great, promote it. If it's not, well, fail early and fail fast. So how do we tie all these accounts together logically? How do we start organizing them? Because all of a sudden you're thinking, well, gee, you're talking about a handful of enterprise accounts and 30, 40, 50, 100 business unit accounts or application accounts. So how do we organize all this stuff? So AWS Organizations, introduced about a year ago, gives you a couple of capabilities that are very, very compelling. So we start with the ability to model your enterprise. Okay, what does your enterprise look like from the top down? Looking at operating divisions, and then subgroups within that, and then finally programs of record, and then finally at the very bottom is all the accounts that support that particular program of record. You're looking at things like what are your service control policies from the top down. Again, throughout the organization, we're allowed to use, for example, FedRAMP compliant tools plus things that are SOC 2 compliant. Okay? You need a mechanism to trigger automation so that you can then provision accounts. So you don't need to go into the account, manually trigger an account creation process. You want automation. You want that from the time you create the account, automatically kick off a whole series of activities that result in, a few minutes later, a fully provisioned account that is tied into your network in a consistent, clear, repeatable way. Finally, the ability to roll up billing to different levels of the organization, consolidate that billing, consolidate that reporting. Okay. So we're going to start at the very top. Your organizational root, typically, oh, there we go. In my case, it's cloudisawesome.gov. Okay, see what I did there with AWS? Oh, come on, that's worth at least a chuckle. And you're assigned at the very top, what are those service control policies? What services is my organization allowed to use? Because that will then trickle down to the lower levels. Add in my operating divisions, like the Office of CIO. Maybe you have public relations. Maybe you have an operations organization. Whatever your organization looks like in that tree structure. Everybody has an organization chart that can be modeled. Okay? Eventually, you get to programs of record. So let's say the Office of CIO decides that they're going to take on those enterprise level accounts. Okay, so they now have another organizational unit tied in. And then below there, we start building out tenant accounts. So you start with shared services and your billing and your logging and security, and you integrate them with, they inherit the service control policies. You add on unique IAM policies. Who's allowed to log into each of those accounts? Which roles are they allowed to assume? What's the security around those accounts? You're tying in what are the financial controls around each of those accounts? Okay, and you're building them all out using automation. So that way, every account in your enterprise gets built out in a consistent, repeatable way. Okay. Now public relations comes along. Now that the enterprise accounts are all there, public relations comes along and says, hey, you know what? We need a content management system. Okay. So let's go ahead and leverage, maybe WordPress in the cloud, and we'll stand that up. Great. So you go out and you provision a 3-pack. Dev, test, production accounts. They all inherit service control policies. They have their own IAM policies so that the PR organization can now bring in whatever contractor they've contracted with to build out that application, and they have an environment to move into. Okay, the landlord has now set up the space for them with a floor plan that they've requested. Maybe its development only needs one availability zone. The other 2 environments need 3 availability zones. Okay, maybe they need both. They need a 3-zone architecture plus a DMZ for bastion hosts. Okay, all these things are laid out in a clear, consistent, repeatable way. So our account automation process, what does that look like? Well, we start with AWS Organizations, and we trigger a new creation process. This could be through the console. More commonly, it's going to be through an API call. Organizations then creates the new account, but it also creates a cross-account role that it can go ahead and assume, which it does. It then goes about doing an account hydration process. This is all the things that are going to happen inside of that account to make it standardized. We'll talk about that a little more in a second. It moves that new account with all of its components now inside of it into a new organizational structure, a new OU, wherever it's been told to live now. And then finally, organizations gets rid of that cross-account role so it can no longer modify anything inside of that account. So it's now hands-off. Okay. What about this hydration that I talked about? What does that look like? Well, this is where you're going to take your automation, your CloudFormation templates, your Terraform, and you're actually going to build out what's going to exist inside that environment, your Python scripts, for example. A couple of assets that you can leverage here right off the bat. First off is AWS Landing Zone solution, introduced literally a couple of days ago. Okay, this gives you a fully functioning environment that will basically give you an account vending machine. You put in some parameters and out come X number of accounts that are linked to your organization structure. They're built out, and again, in a clear, consistent, repeatable way that you can modify. You can adapt to your organization. You can look at things like the NIST compliant quick start templates. Again, they give you the quick start they give you the CloudFormation templates that you can leverage, you can adapt to your organization as you need to. There we go. So what does that standardized baseline account look like? Well, if we look inside of it, we see a model account. Great so far. And it gets built up in layers. First up, we turn on CloudFormation. We load up the template. That template, maybe the first thing it does is it creates a logging account a logging bucket, an S3 logging bucket for that account. Then it's going to go ahead and enable CloudTrail. Turn off by default. Best practice to turn on, we turn it on automatically. We create IAM roles and groups and add policies. We tie in identity providers, so now anyone accessing the account can come in through your Active Directory infrastructure. Okay? So now by doing this, you've removed the administrative burden of managing local accounts in the cloud, and you've tied in management of those accounts with your human resources lifecycle. Employees come in, they get added into groups, they leave the organization, they leave the company, they leave the project. They now get removed from Active Directory. They can no longer access the environment. You lay down your networking. You do things like get rid of all of the default VPCs in all regions everywhere. Then you stand up your own VPC based on your template, one that you've ATO'd, one that you've approved. You know exactly what's in that template and exactly what it does. You know how it meets all of your compliance requirements. Then you turn on things like AWS config so you can make sure that that template doesn't change. No one modifies that VPC. Now, your IAM policies and procedures should make sure that the very limited number of people have permission to do that, but if one of those people happens to change it, and let's say they change it outside of a change window, what are you going to do? Well, you can leverage things like AWS Lambda to trigger an automated process that will change it back. Now you go ahead and integrate with the rest of the environment, tying in the logging, for example, into a logging account. So now you have that steady stream of logging that's going from your accounts, individual accounts all over the place, into a central logging construct that can now feed into a SIEM tool. You tie in networking for the organization. Here I'm showing VPC peering to a shared services account, but it could also be tying it into a transit VPC architecture, for example. You're going to tie in things like your security account so that anyone logging into a security account can also assume a cross-account role and access that account should they need to go and check something out, maybe address incident response. So at this point, I'm going to turn over the discussion to Ray Obrien. Ray's going to give us some insights into NASA's cloud experiences and their journey in governance.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek. That was a great presentation. I can relate to so many things you talked about in there. I really like the 3-pack provisioning. I'll start using that. My name is Ray Obrien. I'm the service manager for NASA Enterprise Managed Cloud Computing. I work at NASA Ames Research Center located near San Francisco, California. And my topic today is NASA Cloud Governance and how we're rethinking, repositioning, and retooling based on some of our experiences to this date. But I want to start out by telling you, I remember when I first became familiar with infrastructure as a service. I remember learning about the NIST definition, or the 26 versions of the NIST definition, looking at some of the early implementations, real providers, providing those types of services. And I just remember thinking, wow, that's really going to change the way NASA computes. And, ever since then, I've been running around telling a lot of people that, anyone that'll talk to me. And, I can see it. It's actually happening. We've been doing this for a few years now. It's happening. And I'm just really thrilled that, there's some groups around NASA that have really, picked up on the advantages, the benefits of infrastructure as a service. They're using AWS today, many of them. And actually, if you go to some of the other sessions, they're speaking, and you can hear the specifics associated with that. But we've learned a few things along the way, and a lot of it, things I'm going to cover are really relevant to this topic. Just thrilled to be here sharing some of this with you. So what I'm going to cover is NASA's approach to dealing with enterprise class requirements for the use of cloud computing. Specifically, my talk is really focused on infrastructure as a service, and how we developed an initial operating capability and where we are today with it. Has been a journey. A few growing pains, again, relevant to this session, and what we're doing now to rethink based on our experience. Okay, so it's been said that when a cloud provider tells you that they are enterprise ready, they have an enterprise class service, that may be the ending point for them, but that's a starting point for any enterprise, any federal enterprise, any enterprise actually that really thinks seriously about governance and security and cost control. It's a starting point. The truth is, especially at the IaaS level, as Amazon will tell you over and over again, it's a shared responsibility approach. And the truth is, there's a lot to do. And when you're in a big enterprise with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, you don't want everyone that wants or needs to use these services to have to address this wall of requirements on their own. First of all, it would be very inefficient. Okay. Second, everyone would do it inconsistently, but the reality is that a lot of them would just consider it to be too daunting. And they'd say, hey, this cloud model is great, but if I got to do all that, I don't know. Wait a few years for others to figure it out. Or they do the opposite, and they figure out how to use these cloud services, without addressing some of these requirements, which is, a governance nightmare. So our approach has really been to, we established a service office, a NASA Enterprise Managed Cloud Computing Service Office, and it's about looking at those things that an agency or an enterprise should do once, and do it well once, and let everyone else leverage it. And as an example of that, Derek mentioned FedRAMP a few times. We're very aligned with the FedRAMP program. We review their packages once, and we issue a provisional agency ATO for the use of those services. Everyone else doesn't have to do that. They still have to take care of their own controls when they're using AWS, but they don't have to go review the FedRAMP package. And I'm proud to say that, because of our involvement early with FedRAMP and trying to make the cloud work for NASA, a member of my team last week was recognized with one of 5 awards. It's FedRAMP 6th anniversary. They handed out 5 awards, and a member of my team received Agency Impact Award for his contributions. He learned a lot of that trying to make, infrastructure and service work for NASA. So FedRAMP packages, that's one thing we do once. The other thing is we, right this stage in our journey down the cloud path, we connect to cloud providers. We connect our network to their network. We don't encourage or really allow anyone to do that on their own. We manage that connectivity centrally. We establish those circuits and connections. We manage capacity, availability, performance, and we do it on everyone's behalf. That has worked out very well. The other thing we do is we have centralized acquisition vehicles for infrastructure as a service, and put those in place. And we do make sure that correct NASA terms and conditions and other NASA protections are in there, and make sure we understand what we're buying and communicate that to the ultimate users of that. But that actually puts us in a very good position to do central provisioning, right? Because we own the contract vehicle, we can do that. And once you're provisioning, you have visibility, you know who's using what. And so those are some examples, of the heavy lift that we do. Okay. But it's one great thing to have an approach. We have this approach, but we had to have a plan for implementing it so people could actually use this enterprise approach. And we had a 4-stage plan. Stage 1 was about developing what we call our IOC, initial operating capability. We spent about 18 months doing that. We developed interfaces, frameworks, processes, relationships with other NASA IT service providers, and then we started operating in Stage 2. And Stage 2 is actually where we are right now. We've been in Stage 2 for about 30 months. And the story here is that it was going really well at the beginning, but as we started adding more and more customers and users, we started slowing down, and to the point where we kind of stalled a bit. And I'm going to tell you why we stalled here in a second. But even though we ran into that, if you're just starting down this cloud path, I encourage you to just get moving, because for all the things we found that maybe don't work so well, we found a lot more that work really well. But best of all, we were able to accommodate and partner with the NASA early adopters. Okay, and the nice thing about that is, I talked about infrastructure as a service changing the way NASA competes. Well, it's really those projects and programs and missions without NASA that are going to lead the way and pave the path for changing the way NASA competes. And they're doing some amazing things already. Go to some of those other sessions, you'll hear about some of those. But really what happened is we couldn't move into Stage 3 easily because of some of these challenges, and it slowed us down. And ultimately we want to get to Stage 4 where we're well-oiled machine, operating, all our processes are well, and people have, the workforce across NASA has a lot of access to these types of infrastructure as a service capabilities. So here's my growing pain number 1. So this is a public sector summit, but about 5 years ago, we were starting out, sent my team, a few members from my team to the reInvent conference, and they came back and they were all excited. Oh, there's so much to learn there. But they came back with but we're worried about this. And the thing they were worried about was account sprawl. They went to a few sessions where a few customers had said, hey, we woke up one day and found out we had hundreds or maybe even thousands of accounts in the enterprise. They had been provisioned independently with no governance, there's no visibility, and you got to watch that. And so, we said, that can't happen to us, that won't happen to us. So we started to go down this path of trying to help people in our Stage 2, initial operating capability, get work done, run applications, other types of work done in a very small number of accounts. So we're managing lots of co-tenants in a very small number of accounts. And that quickly became very difficult to do. If few of the examples that Derek was covering, you start to get more and more people in the same account, and you spend a lot of time, your team will start spending a lot of time crafting policies to keep people from stepping on each other. And they get very frustrated because it's hard to do, and the people waiting for this, access for the to the service get very frustrated because they have to wait so long. Sometimes you just can't do it. You say, we can't give you that capability because potentially you might be able to do things to other tenants in there. You open a ticket, we'll do it for you. And that's really, not the true cloud, endpoint that we want to get to. Same thing with project chargeback. Derek, I really like the way you covered that, some things can be tagged, some things can't be tagged. But even when you have things that can be tagged, it's hard to enforce that sometimes, to get everyone to do that consistently. So we're spending a lot of time trying to go into an account and parse it and say, this is your bill, this is your bill, this is different bills. Sure, there are breadcrumbs. You can eventually trace some of this down, but how much time do you want to spend figuring out who launched what and who did what? And then there's the things that can't be tagged. So you have to develop all these business rules to allocate those shared charges based on some formula. And it's just a lot of work. Third thing was something you touched on too, Derek, is security administration. Just, again, keeping everyone out of each other's business. But when you go down this path, there's going to be some things going to keep you up at night. One of the things that kept me up at night was, what if we did have an account compromise and we have a lot of tenants in there? And what if it was really hard to determine what happened and we had to reconstitute? That would just be a nightmare. So we talked to AWS. We said, hey, can you help us segment these things? Can you give us some isolation mechanisms so people can't see each other when they're in these accounts, at the console or that kind of thing? And they tried. They went back and we weren't the only customer asking. They had other customers asking. They even had a project codenamed, I think, Compartments, that never did see the light of day. But I think they determined at some point that that wasn't the way they wanted to go, because you heard there was something called Organizations announced, and then much like in this session, we're going to hear a lot of talk about multi-account strategy. So, brings me to my next slide. About 9 months ago, we started down the path of using lots of accounts. It's really like the 3-pack and the 6-pack. That's the way it is right now. We're provisioning a lot of accounts for different things. And it certainly solved many of the other problems I just described. There's something really nice about having, everything that's related in one account for blast zone, purposes, for billing purposes, all that. But it creates another set of challenges. And, for example, account inventory. Before we had a few accounts, it was pretty easy to track them. Now we've got, over 100 in about 9 months. Spreadsheet just doesn't cut it anymore. And because the spreadsheet's only as good as the folks updating it, and they have lots of other things to do. Really need is a way to see your world, your universe, account universe in kind of a real-time mode. A better way to do that, I think. Spending controls and budget management. The second thing that keeps me up at night, a spending emergency, inadvertent, something misconfigured. You don't want to wake up to a big bill. That's not a really good thing to happen anywhere. It's really not a good thing to happen when you're in the federal government. And then there's spending control that's maybe something that happened by someone using within NASA or cloud. What you really don't want is some kind of a breach or compromise that creates one of those spending emergencies because someone got in, and that's even worse. So you need to be able to detect that. But what you really need, since NASA doesn't have, I like to call these accounts like little checkbooks. We don't have overdraft protection for each of these checkbooks. We really need better mechanisms for hard stopping, when thresholds are met or hit. And so if you go to Brett's session later on this afternoon, you're going to hear about one tool that NASA's looking at that provides some of those capabilities. Same thing with before we had these IAM policies within one account. Now we have lots of users accessing lots of accounts. There's a lot of policies, resources that need to be, managing those policies has become a challenge, and same with configuration control. Even with some of the tooling that Derek just described, it's still a bit of a challenge there. So we solved some problems, went down this new path, which I think is the right way to go. I really like this, but and we're moving forward again. We're moving into phase 3 of maturity, but we're still looking at how to address some of these challenges, and AWS is helping us. And again, there's some other tools out there that are doing that. So my last slide. So moving forward, that transition from a few accounts to a lot, that was like a little bit uneasy for us, but now we're fully embracing it. Okay, so we're there. This provisioning multiple accounts. Before we sometimes provision 10 counts at a time, for a big group. We've embraced that. But the other thing we're doing is we're retooling. Our tool set before consisted of, what the most popular cloud tool that exists today, management tool, is the do-it-yourself tool, okay? And those only go so far. They don't scale, okay? It's really in line with this session. So we're, not going to do so much of that. We're also going to look at the tooling that we started out with. Back when we started our journey, we've outgrown some of those tools, and some of them maybe haven't kept up because it's kind of a new world, keeping up with all the innovation in the cloud space, especially the IaaS space. And the third thing we're going to do that's, we went in, our comfort zone was data centers and data center tools, and we try to use those as much as possible to help manage our cloud environment. Less of that now. You're seeing the cloud providers, AWS, especially coming out with a really good set of, tools and capabilities. Cloud native, they were built for that environment. And we're really starting to feel a lot more comfortable leveraging those. And sometimes, and again, plug in Brett's other session, there's third-party tools that can really help out too. And when, we need a little bit more help and to enhance the native capabilities and help us operate at scale and help address our other challenges, we'll go down that path. And so we're moving again, and really want to thank AWS for giving me the chance to share our experience with you. And with that, I think that's the end of my portion.
Thanks, Ray.
Sure.
So back to our takeaways. As a quick recap, we've covered why multi-account. The idea that it gives you security blast radius protection. It also gives you far better cost containment and cost management. Okay. Again, avoid those cost emergencies in the middle of the night. Oops, wrong one. Account management, using tools like AWS Organizations to model your organization, to plug in your accounts to different parts of your organization, to drive policies from the top down as far as security control and access. Okay? Leveraging build automation to give you that consistent, repeatable approach to managing your accounts, creating them, and monitoring them over time. And then finally, implementing your cost controls throughout your account structure and being able to consistently and repeatedly monitor for compliance posture. So with that said, we're down to about a minute or so left, so we probably won't be able to take questions here, but we can take them at the corner of the stage. And thank you for your time this morning, and I hope everyone has a great summit.